There's something about a campfire story that makes your blood run cold. But what if one of these tales wasn't just a story? What you're about to read are 5 camping experiences. 5 nights in the wilderness that began ordinarily enough: a tent, a campfire, the quiet rustle of trees. But somewhere between the first spark of a campfire and the last whisper of darkness, something went terribly wrong. 5 stories of isolation, fear, and the unexplained. The catch? Only one of these stories is true or reality. Can you guess which? Story 1. The phone call. It was during the peak of the pandemic in 2021. Like many others, I was going stir-crazy being stuck at home, so I started taking solo camping trips to state parks. I had my reasons for wanting to be alone. A few months earlier, I'd been involved in a workplace incident that resulted in several people losing their jobs. Some blamed me, even though I was just doing what I was supposed to. The harassment started small, angry emails, then calls. I changed my number twice. By spring, things had quieted down. I figured people had moved on, which is partly why I felt comfortable taking these solo trips. This particular weekend, I drove out to Shenandoah National Park, found a secluded spot near a stream, and set up camp. The pandemic meant the trails were practically empty, which suited me fine. I got my tent set up, started a fire, and settled in with some freeze-dried dinner. As night fell, I decided to relax with some edibles. Nothing crazy, just enough to take the edge off. That's when my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Nice spot you picked." My heart nearly stopped. Another message. "The stream is beautiful this time of year." I replied, "Who is this?" The response came quickly. "Just enjoying the view." The edibles were starting to kick in, which only amplified my paranoia. I grabbed my hunting knife, the only protection I had, and scanned the darkness beyond my fire. The trees seemed to close in around me. Another message. "Don't worry, I'll keep my distance. For now." I heard a twig snap somewhere in the darkness. Then footsteps crunching through leaves. I killed my fire and retreated to my tent, knife clutched in my sweating hand. The footsteps circled my campsite, getting closer, then further away, then closer again. My phone buzzed, "Sweet dreams." Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter. Seconds later, my phone lit up with a photo of my tent, taken from just outside. Something in me snapped. Maybe it was the fear, maybe the edibles wearing off, but I burst out of my tent screaming like a madman, swinging my knife wildly. I heard someone crash through the undergrowth, running away. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, listening to every sound until dawn finally broke. I never got another message after that night, but I also never went camping alone again. Story 2. The family tradition. Every autumn when I was growing up, my extended family would gather at my Uncle Steve's cabin in the Adirondacks. It was a massive place on 30 acres, most of it dense forest. I was 12 that year, and my cousins Mike and Chris were 11 and 9. We'd always wanted to camp in those woods, but our parents had never allowed it. That year, after much begging, and probably helped by the several beers our dads had consumed, they finally agreed. Uncle Steve helped us set up a tent in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the house. It was just past the property line, where he'd marked trees with blue paint. "Perfect spot," he said, pointing out the soft moss that would make good bedding. "I've camped here myself plenty of times. Our moms weren't happy about it, but our dads insisted we'd be fine. They're close enough that we'll hear them if anything happens," my dad joked, which didn't exactly reassure anyone. Still, they let us go. We spent the early evening playing card games by flashlight, telling ghost stories, and eating the snacks we'd smuggled out. Everything was fine until we heard it, a high-pitched scream that echoed through the trees. We all froze. Mike tried to convince us it was just a fox. They can sound remarkably human-like when they scream. We wanted to believe him, but then we heard it again, closer this time. Much closer, and it didn't sound like any fox. It sounded like a woman in pain. We killed our flashlights and huddled in our sleeping bags, too scared to run back to the house. The footsteps came next, something circling our tent, crunching through the fallen leaves. Then the screaming started again, right outside our tent. The walls shook violently as someone, grabbed at the fabric. We all started screaming, Chris and Mike in terror. While I yelled threats, I was too scared to back up. Finally, I unzipped the tent and we bolted, running blindly through the woods toward the house's lights. We burst into the yard screaming, and found our entire family already outside, looking worried. My first thought was that it had been my older sister and female cousins playing a prank, but they were all accounted for, already in bed. Our dads grabbed their rifles and went to investigate, but found nothing. The next day, when we went to collect our abandoned tent and supplies, everything was exactly as we'd left it in our panic. No footprints, no signs of disturbance. We never camped in those woods again. The family still goes up to the cabin every year, but none of us kids, now adults with our own children, let our kids play in the woods after dark. Story 3. The Thing in the Dark. What I'm about to tell you happened last summer, and I still question whether it was real or some kind of shared hallucination. My mother insists we must have eaten some bad mushrooms or something, but I know what my father and I experienced. We were camping at an old state park in Vermont, the kind of place with both designated campsites and deep wilderness. The first night was perfect, other campers nearby, kids playing, the smell of campfires everywhere. But the second night, we were the only ones there. The entire campground had cleared out. We spent the day hiking and fishing, enjoying the solitude. But as sunset approached, something felt wrong. The air got heavy like before a storm, but the sky was clear. The trees seemed to press in closer. Even my dad, who's never been one to spook easily, mentioned that something felt off. We were walking back from the ranger station when it started. First, it was just this feeling of being watched. Then came the sounds, like trees falling, but not quite. Boom. Then another closer. Boom. Whatever it was moving toward our campsite. We tried to laugh it off, but then came the third boom, close enough to shake the ground. We dove into our tent, leaving our supplies scattered outside. That's when my dad saw it. He won't describe exactly what he saw, just says it was like a piece of darkness that moved wrong. Then came the humming. Not just a sound, you could feel it in your chest, like standing too close to a massive speaker. It made breathing difficult, made thinking hard. And then the other noise started. This awful guttural sound that I can only compare to something from a sci-fi horror movie. The strange part is, neither of us remembers falling asleep. We just woke up. Our phones were dead, though they'd been fully charged. The fire had burned out completely, but our food was untouched. Not even animals had disturbed it during the night. We waited until dawn, packed up in silence, and left. We haven't been camping since. Sometimes I catch my dad staring into the woods behind our house with this strange look on his face. When I ask him about that night, he just shakes his head and says, "Some things aren't meant to be understood." Story 4. The Lake Trail. I've been an avid hiker and camper for years, but what happened at Lake Superior State Forest last fall changed everything. I was doing a 3-day solo camping trip, something I'd done dozens of times before. The lake trail was supposed to be easy, a 6-mile loop that would take me to a secluded camping spot overlooking the water. The first red flag was the ranger station. It was closed with a handwritten sign saying "Back tomorrow" taped to the window. Weird for a Friday, but I had my permit printed out, so I figured it was fine. The parking lot was empty except for one beat-up pickup truck. The hike started normally enough. The trail was well marked, winding through old-growth forest before opening up to lake views. I made good time and reached my designated campsite by mid-afternoon. It was perfect, a flat spot about 50 yards from the lake's edge, sheltered by towering pines. As I was setting up my tent, I noticed something odd. There were other tent stake holes in the ground, forming a perfect circle. Lots of them, like someone had set up and taken down their tent repeatedly in exactly the same spot. The holes looked fresh. Just before sunset, I heard whistling coming from the trail, that universal tune everyone knows but nobody knows the name of. I expected to see another hiker pass by, but nobody came. The whistling just faded out, like whoever was making it had turned around. After dark, I was sitting by my fire when I noticed a light across the lake. It looked like a flashlight beam, sweeping back and forth along the shoreline. Then another light appeared, and another. Soon there were 5 or 6 lights, all moving in perfect synchronization. I killed my fire and retreated to my tent, trying to convince myself it was just other campers. That's when the whistling started again, much closer this time. It was coming from multiple directions, all slightly out of sync, creating this dissonant echo that made my skin crawl. My tent's rain fly rustled in the wind, and I caught a glimpse of something through the mesh window, a figure standing at the tree line. Even in the darkness, I could tell they were wearing some kind of old-fashioned clothes, like something from a century ago. Then I saw another figure, and another. They just stood there watching. I could hear them whistling that same tune over and over. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. The figures started moving closer, still whistling, still in perfect sync with each other. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have. I woke up to morning light and dead silence. My tent was surrounded by footprints, dozens of them, all the same size and depth, forming the same perfect circle as those tent stake holes. When I got back to my car, the ranger station was open. I asked about the other campers, and the ranger looked at me strange. "You were the only one with a permit this weekend," she said. "That whole area has been closed for maintenance. How did you even get out there?" I drove home and immediately started researching the area's history. Turns out, in the early 1900s, a group of campers disappeared from that exact spot. They were never found, but witnesses reported seeing strange lights across the lake and hearing whistling in the woods for weeks afterward. I still go camping, but never alone, and never anywhere near Lake Superior State Forest. Sometimes, when I'm lying in my tent at night, I catch myself whistling that tune, the one I can never quite remember the name of. Story 5. The Lodge. Back in '99, I was working maintenance at Cedar Lodge, just outside Yosemite National Park. It was a beautiful spot. Tourists loved it because it offered that perfect balance of comfort and wilderness access. Plenty of camping spots nearby, hiking trails everywhere, and the lodge itself for those who wanted more creature comforts. February was usually quiet, but we still had a steady stream of visitors. This one family caught my attention, a mom and 2 teenage girls, plus another woman who was traveling with them. They were staying in the lodge, but spent their days hiking and picnicking in the park. The kind of wholesome family vacation you'd expect in Yosemite. I remember chatting with them one morning as they loaded up their car for a day trip. They were planning to check out some camping spots for their next visit. The youngest girl was excited about seeing the waterfalls. They seemed so happy, so normal. That evening, when I finished my shift, I noticed their car was back in the parking lot. But something felt off. The next morning, they didn't come down for breakfast. Their room was untouched, beds still made, bags still packed. The police were called. What happened next shook our entire community. The mom and one of the girls were found in their car, which had been set on fire to hide evidence. The other 2 were found near a camping area off Highway 108. The FBI swarmed the place. They interviewed everyone, including all of us who worked at the lodge. But the thing that haunts me most? The killer had been hiding in plain sight. He worked there just like me. He'd been planning it for months, watching guests come and go, learning their routines. He even helped with the search parties, acting just as shocked and concerned as the rest of us. When they finally caught him months later, he confessed to everything. He'd been living in the park for years, moving between camping sites and employee housing, all while planning these horrible acts. He knew every trail, every back road, every hiding spot. I still work in Yosemite, but at a different lodge now. Sometimes I see families checking in, planning their camping trips, and I want to warn them. Not about the wildlife or the terrain. Those dangers are obvious. It's the human predators you have to watch out for, the ones hiding behind friendly smiles and helpful advice. The park is still beautiful, still draws millions of visitors every year. But for those of us who were there in '99, it's different now. Every time I drive past Cedar Lodge, I remember those girls and their mom, how excited they were about their vacation. How none of us knew what was coming. I used to love camping in the park after work. Now I stick to the lodge. Some places, once they're touched by darkness, never feel safe again. The truth behind the tales. As you've watched these 5 stories, one question has been burning in your mind. Which one actually happened? Each narrative contains elements that feel uncomfortably real. The specific details, the raw emotional description, the lingering sense of something just beyond understanding. A stalker's text messages. A family's terrifying night in the woods. Unexplained sounds in the darkness. Mysterious figures by a lake. A tragedy that shook an entire community. All entirely convincing. But only on entirely true. But which one? So now the reveal. Story number 5. The Lodge is based on actual events and is the one story that is true. In 1999, Cary Stainer, a handyman at the Cedar Lodge near Yosemite National Park, committed a series of murders that shocked the nation. His victims included Carol Sund, her daughter Julie, Julie's friend Silvina Palazzo, and later, park naturalist Joa Armstrong. Stainer utilized his position at the lodge to gain access to the victims, leading to their tragic deaths. He was eventually apprehended and confessed to the crimes. For a detailed explanation and the full true story of the lodge, including another video, head over to the community tab. Anyway, sleep tight. And maybe think twice about your next camping trip. If you've got a scary camping story to share, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to watch more videos like this, be sure to check out my channel, where I'll be sharing more terrifying tales that'll give you chills.